Now, in the last lesson, we spoke about why we need to create templates when we're creating websites that have very similar content to each other. So the example we used is that if we checked whether if the current day was equal to a Saturday or a Sunday, then we could send different HTML files. So one that is weekend.html that says, it's the weekend, why are you working? And if it was not a Saturday or Sunday, then we would send the weekday file, which says, it's a weekday, why are you not working? Now, this works to some extent if you only have, say, 2 of these if-else statements. But say if you wanted to have a different file for each day of the week that said it's a Monday or it's a Tuesday, then you would need 7 such of these HTML files. And even worse, if you're creating a blog post, or in our case, we're creating a to-do list. If the user had a different to-do list, for example, a work list, a home list, a grocery list, then you would need to create a new HTML page for every single one of those lists, even though the actual content of each of the lists are really, really similar. So that's where we got up to in the last lesson. So now hopefully you understand why we need to think about templates and templating. But in this lesson, we're going to tackle the how. How do we exactly go about making a template? Well, there's several tools that help you to do this, but the one that we're going to talk about is something called EJS, or Embedded JavaScript Templating. So if you head over, so as always, whenever you're using a new piece of technology, the best place to start with is the documentation. So if you head over to ejs.co, then you'll find this page that tells you how to get started, how to use it, and a whole bunch of documentation on how this templating software will help you. Now, in our case, we need to scroll down to this part using EJS with Express. That will be super relevant to us because that's pretty much exactly what we're doing, right? We're using Express to build our app and our server, and we're going to use EJS with it. So if we head over to this GitHub wiki page, then we will get to see the more specific instructions on how we can use EJS with Express. So I recommend reading through this as well as the documentation on ejs.co, and then we can get started using it. So the first step to using anything is, of course, to install it with npm. So let's head over to hyper.js, let's quit our server with Control-C, and then we're going to npm install our brand new EJS module. So now that's done, and if we check inside our package.json, you can see we're now using EJS, Express, and body parser. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to set our app's view engine to EJS. Now, as I alluded to before, EJS is not the only module that can help us do this, but it is one of the easiest to work with, which is why I'm using it in this tutorial. And you'll find that it's one of the most popular ones that Node developers will choose, so you're definitely in good company. So the first thing we need to do is to tell our app to use EJS. So you can either copy this line of code or write it out, but just make sure that you've typed this exactly as you see here. So there's a space between view and engine, and they are lowercase. This is really important for your app to work. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in here. So this line of code tells our app, which is generated using Express, to use EJS as its view engine. And it's really important that you place this line of code below this one, because if you try to place it above, then at this point app doesn't exist yet, and you will get errors telling you that app was used before it was declared. So that's a particular message that you can watch out for. So the usual place to put it is just below where you declared your new app constant. Okay, so let's check back here to see what else we need to do. So we've already got our app listen set up, and we've already got a app.get on our home route. And then inside the callback, they're using a new method called res.render. And this uses the view engine that we set up here to render a particular page. So in this case, we're rendering a page called index. And that will be an index.ejs page. So up here it says that this code assumes that a views directory exists and it contains a index.ejs file. So in order to use EJS or pretty much any of the view engines, then we need to first create a new folder called views. And it's all in lowercase. And this is where the view engine by default will go and look for the files that you're trying to render. So let's head over to our views folder and I'm going to create a new EJS file. Now, instead of calling it index.ejs, I'm going to name it more relevant to our project. So I'm going to call it list.ejs. So this is going to be the base template to create all of our to-do lists. So now inside this list.ejs file, you're essentially writing HTML code. So let's head over to our index.html, which we had before, and I'm just going to copy all of the code into our list.ejs. So anything that is valid HTML will be valid for an EJS file. Now in our page, I'm going to keep it simple. So we only have a title, which is called to-do list, and an H1. Now my goal is to change this word here so that it will display the current day of the week. So for example, today is a Thursday, so my H1 should say it's a Thursday, but tomorrow when I load up this page, it should say it's a Friday. So I need to be able to essentially pass some information from my app.js file, which is, remember, where all of the logic and the code gets executed, and take the result of that logic to place it in here. So I should be able to check for the current day of the week and then to send that information over to my list.ejs and place that day of the week right here so that when I render this list.ejs, this H1 gets completed with the day of the week. So let's see how we can do that using EJS. Now, if you take a look at their example, you can see that they're passing over a variable called foo, and the value is just the word foo in all caps. So we can do exactly the same thing. Now, inside our list.ejs, we're going to add a marker that's going to tell the file that this is where you should place a particular variable. Now, the marker for EJS looks like this. It's a angle bracket, a percentage sign, and then an equal sign, and then inside there you're going to place your variable name, and you complete this tag with, again, a percentage sign and a closing angle bracket. So this is a marker that tells the file to replace whatever is inside here with the value of the variable. So if inside our app.js, we check to see whether if the current day was a Saturday or a Sunday, so we could create a variable called day that starts off being an empty string. And then later on, if the current day was equal to a Saturday or a Sunday, then we can change this day into, to say, weekend. But else, if it's not a Saturday or Sunday, then day will equal to weekday. And what we want to do is we want to be able to send this variable day over to our list.ejs. So let's first place a marker for that variable. So as we saw before, we need to add an angle bracket and then a percentage sign and an equal sign. And then we're going to have a closing tag that's comprised of a percentage sign and a closing angle bracket. And now inside here is where we can put in the variable name that we want to replace this marker with. So in our case, I'm going to call it kind of day, as in the kind of day. And the reason why I'm not calling it day is so that I can make it super clear for you how we're passing this information through. So now, instead of using res.sendFile, we're going to use this brand new method called res.render. And the page that we're going to render is, of course, our list.ejs. And the variable that we pass in is going to be a JavaScript object. So inside a set of curly braces, and we get to have a key and a value. So if we go into our if statement and we call res.render and we render the file that is list. So when we write this, then Express is going to look inside a folder called views, and it's going to look for a file that's called list, and it has the extension of EJS. Now, if you don't have this folder called views, or if you don't have a file called list.ejs inside the views, then this line of code is not going to work. So this is a really important step, making that views folder. So we're going to render list, and then we're going to pass in a JavaScript object, which has a key value pair. Now, the key in this case has to match with whatever you put in here. So you might as well go over here and Command C or Control C to copy that, because it has to be written exactly the same with no spelling differences and no difference in capitalization. So this is basically saying render a file called list, and we're going to pass that file a variable called kind of day, and the value is going to equal to whatever is the value of our current variable, which is day. So to reiterate the process, we're creating our response by rendering a file called list, which has to exist inside a views folder, and it has to have the extension .ejs. And then into that list file, we're passing in a single variable that has the name of kind of day. And the value that we're giving it is the value of our variable day. So we can copy and paste this code so that exists in both the if and the else statements. But actually, if you think about it, we can leave the if and else statement to do our logic, namely change the variable day to whatever it is, weekend or weekday. And then after that if-else statement, we can add it just before we end our app.get route. So we can say res.render our list.ejs, passing a variable called kind of day, the value of which is equal to the value of our variable day. So that means that you can do a lot of logic and computation and processing, and then only pass over the result of all of that logic to your template file. So let's hit save and let's go ahead and restart our server. So now if I refresh my page, then you'll see that I'm getting this being passed over to kind of day, and which replaces this marker inside my template. Now, what you'll commonly see when you see people using EJS templating and Express is that they'll use the same name for the variable. So for example, they'll use the variable name day over here, and that means this also has to be day, and you'll see day : day. Now, this I find personally to be quite confusing, because when you first look at it, you don't know whether if this is equal to this or whether if this is equal to this. So just to be aware that this is what most people will use when they're coding with Express and a templating engine. But to start with, I recommend actually to use different variable names just to make it really clear to yourself what's actually going on. And as a challenge, so that you can try this out and see if you can make it work, instead of just saying day is equal to weekend or weekday, I want you to write out the full 7 days. So once you're done, when we render this page, if it's a Thursday, then it should say it's a Thursday. And if it's a Tuesday, then it'll say it's a Tuesday. So pause the video now and see if you can change this code that you've currently got to render the current day of the week. All right, so this shouldn't be too difficult. The first thing we need to do is to check what day of the week it is. So you can see that with current day, we only get a number, and we have to turn that number into a piece of text that we're going to store inside this variable called day. Now, some of you might have chosen to do this with if and else statements. Others might have chosen to use a switch statement, but both ways work. I think as a rule of thumb, if you have more than 5 if-else statements, I tend to recommend to use a switch statement. And if you have less than 5, then it's probably more efficient to use if and else if statements. So let's create our switch statement, and let's use our autocomplete to just add in all the parts that we need. So the expression that we're going to switch on is this variable called current day. This is going to be the one that has the numbers, right? So we're going to switch on the value of current day. And in the case where current day is equal to 0, then we're going to change the value of our variable day to the string that is Sunday. And then we have a break, and that break will exit our switch statement. And now we can add a whole bunch of cases. So we should have 7 in total. And let me just use the beautify shortcut to just get that straightened out. And now we can replace our cases. All right, so now we have our complete switch statement, and the final thing that we need to do is to add a log statement or throw an error when our current day is not covered by any of these cases. Now, this should never ever happen because there is no 8th day of the week, so this should never ever be triggered. But just in case, we want to know what on earth is going on. So I'm going to say error current day is equal to plus the value of current day that triggered this default case. So in most cases, your default case should never ever be triggered, but if it does, then it's a good idea to log the expression that caused that default case so that you can fix any bugs or anything that you overlooked. So now that we have our switch statement that will change the value of day to whatever day it is, and then we're going to pass the value of that over here and into this variable called kind of day, which has to match with the one that we add in here inside the EJS marker, and it will replace this entire marker with the value of day. So now if we hit save and we go ahead and refresh our local host, then you can see that we get rendered the H1, which says it's a Thursday, or some might know it as Thor's Day, that guy with the hammer's day. So now you have created your very first template. And as you can imagine, as our code gets more complicated, we can pass over more and more variables which will flesh out our templates. In the next lesson, we're going to look at another feature of templating, which is the ability to run code inside the HTML file. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.